In this final video for this week, we consider some other experiments in modern government from some of the smaller Polynesian islands. First, let's consider what we've discussed so far in previous weeks. Was there a tradition of centralized administration in some of these smaller Polynesian groups? If we look at the list on the left here of Tuvalu, Rotuma, Vea and Futuna, Tokelau, Niue, the Cook Islands, and Rapa Nui, the only islands which had a tradition of central administration in their indigenous societies are highlighted in bold. Rotuma had the Ngangaj chiefs and the rotational leadership of the Fakpure and Sao. Uvea, also known as Wallace by its colonial name, was ruled by the Lavalua, and Futuna was split into two kingdoms, each with their own ruler or Aliki Sao. Tui Angaifo for Alo district and the Tui Singave for the Singave district. In Tokelau, there were chiefly Ariki based in Whakaofo, and we talked previously about the Tui Tokelau, both a title but also a reference to a godlike deity. In Niue, there is evidence of a Tongan Eiki or chief that ruled this island. Whereas for the groups of Tuvalu, Cook Islands, and Rapa Nui, there was not a tradition of central administration. The nations of Tuvalu and the Cook Islands were colonial creations, and Rapa Nui's traditional leadership structure was almost wiped out by environmental destruction and colonial contact. But let's look at some specific examples of ways in which these particular islands may have adapted their leadership systems in response to foreign contact. Rotuma is the first example. In Rotuma, divided traditionally into 7 districts, each of these districts were ruled by a ngangaj, or a district chief. And we've discussed previously how the Fakpure, Sao, and Mua titles were rotated between the ngangaj and served certain purposes within the society. The Sao and the Mua positions were abandoned in the 1870s under missionary pressure, and we see the role of the missionaries as playing an important role in Rotuma's colonial history. The district chief titles would continue, but under a new missionary influence. And let's look at this history, sometimes referred to as the religious wars within Rotuma. Soon after the middle of the 19th century, missionaries from the Wesleyan and Roman Catholic churches established themselves in Rotuma. Unfortunately, the French priests and English ministers were less tolerant towards one another's labours, and a religious factionalism based on previous political rivalries ensued. Each mission marked off its own territorial domain and jealously guarded its converts from the influences of the other side. An increasing number of disputes arose between adherents of the opposing faiths, often over the question of rights to build churches on communally held land. Antagonisms continued to mount until 1878, when they culminated in a war between the two sides, in which the Catholics were defeated by the numerically superior Wesleyans. As a result, Fanguta, the only Roman Catholic district, was divided into 2 by the Wesleyan victors to weaken the power of the Catholic ngangaj. From Fanguta, Juju and Pepje were formed, making 7 districts which continue today. The unrest following this war led to the paramount chiefs of Rotuma's 7 districts to petition England for annexation, and in 1881 the island was officially ceded to Great Britain. The British decided that Rotuma would be administered as part of the colony of Fiji, the nearest crown colony, rather than as a separate unit. A resident commissioner was appointed to govern Rotuma, along with an advisory body consisting of the 7 paramount chiefs. English rule of law was subsequently applied, But Rotumans did not simply adopt Western culture uncritically. They worked hard to preserve their own customs and resisted the colonial government's misguided attempts to introduce radical change. Rotumans attempted to retain control of their own destiny in whatever ways that they could. And for more reading about this particular topic, I suggest this book by Aubrey Park, available online and at the university library, Rotuma, Custom, Practice and Change. Now let's look at the example of Uvea and Futuna, in which traditional leadership systems were influenced by Catholic missionaries. In the 1830s, French Catholic missionaries had arrived. Bataillon in Uvea and two missionaries, Brother Delorme and Father Peter Chanel in Futuna. Like other Polynesian islands, the missionaries that arrived in Uvea and Futuna found themselves embroiled in wars between Alo and Singave, and there was significant opposition to the missions at first. When King Nuliki's son was converted in 1841, Father Peter Chanel was murdered in response. The impact of this key event would be to spur mass conversion to Catholicism within these islands. Uvea and Futuna became the bastion of Catholic evangelization in Oceania, particularly in Samoa, Tonga, and Fiji. In Futuna, the movement was supported by the Aliki. They created a militia to ensure people's obedience. Bataillon became virtually the ruler of both Uvea and Futuna and asserted his moral authority. The Aliki Sao and Aliki recognized him as the supreme authority of the new religion and included him in all customary ceremonies. The Vicariate of Central Oceania was created in 1843. After the kings, this church had become the second most powerful institution. The mission would play a leading role in future relationships with France and the eventual protectorate status that Uvea fell under in 1886 and Futuna in 1888. Much later in 1961, this protectorate status was changed. These two islands became overseas territories of France. And you can see here an image of Father Peter Chanel commemorated in a postage stamp, and an image of one of the churches in the area in which he had evangelized. We do not have a clear example of how Tokelauan societies adapted their indigenous leadership systems to foreign contact. However, there is an interesting side note about an exodus in 1852 documented by Judith Huntsman, and it's connected to the islands of Uvea and Futuna. 500 people were forcibly removed from the Tokelau atoll of Whakaofo in February 1852 and were shipped to Uvea at the instigation of the Bishop for Central Oceania. So if you're interested in reading about this particular case study, I've included the link here so you can find out about this curious case in which a group of Tokelauans were transported forcibly to Uvea, and what this might have meant for the leadership system within both those societies. Niue provides another interesting case study of how a central administration was influenced by Protestant missionaries. In Niue, there was a traditional chiefly line of kings known as Patuiki. Historians suggest that the Patuiki kingship may have been introduced through contact with Samoa or Tonga around 1700. And from then on, a succession of kings ruled the island, the first of whom was Punimata. The function of the monarch was non-hereditary. They were reportedly elected by the Niuean population, with the candidates being issued from influential families. As described by Stevenson Percy Smith in 1903, Niue appears therefore to have been a democratic elective monarchy. Protestant missionary influence in the late 1800s likely impacted this process of electing kings, and competition within families may have resulted in the use of missionaries as allies to support particular claims. This may explain why there were requests for British protection from different kings in Niue, which was ultimately granted in 1900. And since then, Niue, this led or contributed to Niue and the Cook Islands coming under the rule of the colony of New Zealand. That's a very, very brief overview, but there are some wonderful texts in the USP library about Niue's history, most recently one by Margaret Poynter, documenting that change from 1774 right up to the 20th century. Finally, we are with Rapa Nui, an authority system which likely collapsed before the Western colonial period, when a population of approximately 20,000 people was reduced to only an estimated 110. There's a number of different theories as to why the population of Rapa Nui collapsed so quickly. Some have blamed the Polynesian rats and Western-derived diseases. And I've listed a couple of different websites here in which you can examine the main theories for the collapse of Rapa Nui, and examine the evidence that is used to support these theories. Of interest, however, for this particular topic is how the surviving people of Rapa Nui responded and adapted after colonial contact. The Peruvian slave trade from 1862 to 1863 devastated the remaining population by bringing smallpox and tuberculosis. As a result, a number of the key leaders, as well as the commoners, were killed. This included the Ariki Mau, or the paramount chief at the time, and his son. By 1872, with an estimated population of only just over 100 individuals, most of the paramount chiefs and priests had perished. However, many of the people remaining were aware that Chile wanted to annex Easter Island, and so, in collaborations with the Bishop of Tahiti, they decided to appoint a new king, known as Tekena. Tekena was baptized as Atamu Tekena, referring to Adam Tekena, as in Adam and Eve from the Bible. This new line would continue as a way of responding to Chilean efforts to annex the territory and having a key leader or contact point who could fight for Rapa Nuian sovereignty. And that explains why we have a new flag from the Kingdom of Easter Island on the left here from 1876 to 1888. This kingly line was elected, and in 1890 Simeon Riro Kainga won the election and was appointed king. However, the situation of the islanders deteriorated in the following years as they became slaves on their own land, and Chilean efforts to annex the territory grew in strength. Simeon's effort to resist this led to his poisoning on his route travelling to mainland Chile, and it's a tragic story of the last efforts by the Rapa Nuian people to ensure their sovereignty was protected and to resist colonial influence. In conclusion, apart from Tokelau, Uvea and Futuna, and possibly Rotuma, a tradition of indigenous central authority is not evident in any of the other 5 societies. Each island was ruled by an autonomous tribe, often in temporary alliance with other tribes. Their political heartlands were small, localized, and autonomous polities. I've given a number of different readings in these slides, so if you choose to deep dive further into these topics and look at these case studies for your subsequent assignments, I encourage you to do so. And I apologize in advance that we didn't have enough time in this course to delve more deeply into the histories of these islands. Thank you.